The brown envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday in March, thrust under the door of my apartment in Birmingham while I was brewing tea. Inside was a check for £15,000, the preliminary deeds to a 3-bedroom house in Solihull, and a typewritten letter on the official letterhead of the West Midlands Central Congregation's Kingdom Hall. My hands trembled holding those papers, not with joy or gratitude, but with a deep rage I thought I had buried 17 years ago, when I last walked through the doors of the place I once called my spiritual home. They wanted me back. Not with soft words of repentance or sincere apologies for what they did to me and my family. Not with an acknowledgement of the stolen years, the destroyed friendships, the marriage shattered by the cruel policy of disfellowshipping that turned me into a ghost to my own daughter. They wanted to buy my silence and my loyalty like someone trading cattle at a market. The check came with conditions printed in fine print on the second page. I was to return to meetings, participate in the weekly Bible study, publicly retract my apostasies, and, most importantly, cease any communication with former members who were suing the organization for psychological abuse. I sat in the worn chair of my small kitchen, the same one where I had dined alone for nearly 2 decades, and looked out the window at the wet streets of Birmingham. At 60 years old, I had built a modest but honest life far from that structure that controlled every breath, every thought, every relationship. I had found peace in the solitude they imposed as punishment. And now they came with money and promises, expecting me to forget everything, expecting me to betray those who finally found the courage to expose the truth about the backstage of that organization that presents itself to the world as a refuge of Christian love. I tore the check in half, then into quarters, then into pieces so small they looked like bitter confetti. The house deeds went straight into the paper shredder I bought when I started my modest freelance accounting work. The letter, however, I kept, because I knew one day I would need to tell this story. Today is that day. My name is Winston Davies. I am 60 years old, and this is the story of how Jehovah's Witnesses tried to buy my return, and why I refused every penny of that poisoned offer. Before we dive into this journey that completely changed the course of my life, I need you to do something for me. If this story touches something inside your chest, if you know someone who has gone through similar experiences within controlling religious organizations, or if you simply want to support true accounts that rarely reach the surface, please hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories of real people who had the courage to break away from systems that promised salvation but delivered imprisonment. And in the comments, please write which city you are watching from. I want to know where the people are who need to hear that they are not alone, that the guilt and shame they carry are not theirs, but belong to the system that manipulated them. This is not an easy story to tell. For 17 years, I kept these memories locked in a mental drawer I rarely opened, except in the sleepless hours of dawn, when the past knocked at the door disguised as a nightmare. But when that envelope arrived, when I saw the audacity of that attempted bribe disguised as Christian mercy, I knew my silence served no one anymore, especially not myself. The moment had come to speak, not out of revenge or bitterness, but for the naked, raw truth about how the internal mechanisms of an organization that controls millions of lives around the planet actually work. I will take you through 4 decades of my life, from the 9-year-old boy accompanying his mother to Kingdom Hall meetings in Liverpool, to the 60-year-old man who refuses to sell his dignity for £15,000 and a suburban house. You will see behind the scenes of elders' meetings, the unwritten policies that destroy families, the internal judicial system that functions like a medieval court without the right to a proper defense. You will understand why they came after me specifically now, after almost 2 decades of absolute silence, and what this reveals about the desperation of an organization facing unprecedented public scrutiny. I am not here to attack anyone's faith or to say that every Jehovah's Witness is a bad person. I met genuinely kind people during my 40 years inside the organization. But individual kindness does not erase destructive institutional policies, and it is these policies we need to talk about. So take a deep breath, because we are about to enter a world that few on the outside truly understand, a world where love is conditional, forgiveness comes with asterisks, and family means only those who obey without question. My journey with Jehovah's Witnesses began before I even understood what it meant to have a spiritual journey of my own. My mother, Dorothy Davies, converted in 1968 when I was just 3 years old, after two ladies knocked on the door of our tiny apartment in Toxteth, Liverpool, offering free Bible studies and the promise of a coming earthly paradise. Dad had abandoned the family 6 months earlier, taking his dockworker's wages with him, and leaving my mother with 3 small children, no professional qualifications, and a devastating loneliness that made any promise of a fraternal community irresistible. For her, those women didn't just bring Watchtower magazines and colorful tracts about the end of the world. They brought tangible hope of belonging and purpose at a time when life felt like a dead end. I remember waking up on Saturday mornings, still sleepy, while Mum was already dressed in her best outfit, the gray one she saved for special occasions, packing her preaching bag with stacks of magazines and brochures. She forced me to wear corduroy trousers that made my legs itch and a white shirt that was always too small, and we would go out through the streets of Liverpool knocking from door to door. I was 9 years old and hated every second of it. The other neighborhood kids mocked me, calling me the little preacher, and their parents often slammed the door in our faces before Mum could even finish her rehearsed presentation. But for her, that was sacred service, and my resistance was just selfishness that needed to be overcome with discipline and prayer. Meetings took place 3 times a week at the Prince's Road Kingdom Hall, a square red brick building with no decorative windows or architectural charm, perfectly reflecting the organization's philosophy of rejecting worldly ostentation. Tuesday and Thursday nights, from 7 to 9, and Sunday mornings, from 10 to noon. Each meeting followed a rigid script published by the world headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. We studied the same magazines, sang the same hymns from the official songbook, repeated the same answers underlined in paragraphs previously studied at home. There was no room for genuine questioning or open theological discussions. The truth was already established by the governing body, that group of elderly men at the top of the hierarchy who claimed to receive direct divine guidance, and our role was simply to absorb and obey. At 13, I was baptized at the Regional Assembly in Manchester, dipped into an inflatable tank installed in the convention stadium along with 57 other people, mostly teenagers, like me, who had been raised in the organization, and for whom that step was not a genuine choice, but an inexorable expectation. I remember Brother Callahan, a robust elder with breath like stale coffee, holding my back as he dipped me backward into the cold water, pronouncing the ritual words about dedication to Jehovah and his organization on earth. When I emerged, coughing and with eyes stinging from chlorine, my mother was crying in the stands, convinced she had secured my eternal salvation. I just felt cold, and a strange emptiness I couldn't name, a feeling that I had signed a contract whose fine print no one had let me read. The following years were an increasingly deep dive into the organizational structure. I became a ministerial servant at 21, responsible for administrative tasks in the congregation, counting literature, organizing preaching territories, taking care of hall maintenance. I married Sandra Fletcher at 23, a quiet, obedient girl from a third-generation witness family whom I met at a district convention in Leeds. We moved to Birmingham when I got a decent job at an accounting firm willing to accommodate my need to miss work every Tuesday and Thursday evening and half of Sunday. Our daughter Abigail was born in 1987, and from the cradle, she was indoctrinated in the ways of the organization, just as I had been. On the outside, we were the model witness family, always at meetings, regular pioneers fulfilling 70 hours of preaching a month, cited as examples for baptisms and demonstration parts in assemblies. On the inside, I was slowly suffocating under the weight of growing doubts I dared not verbalize even to myself. It took 40 years for me to finally see the chains, but once I saw them, there was no way to pretend they were ornaments. And when I tried to remove them, I discovered that the price of freedom in an organization that proclaims itself loving was losing everything and everyone I had known my entire life. But I'm getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand how the control mechanisms work, how they build the prison walls so gradually that you thank them for every brick, thinking it's protection against the wicked world outside. The genius of Jehovah's Witnesses' control lies in its invisibility to those inside. No one shouts orders or threatens physical violence. There are no literal chains or locked doors. Control operates through something much more subtle and devastating: the genuine conviction that obeying the organization is obeying God, and questioning any aspect of doctrine or policy is apostasy, resulting in eternal destruction at the imminent Armageddon. This simple equation, hammered home at every meeting, every publication, every informal conversation between members, creates a mental prison from which escape seems not only difficult but literally fatal to your immortal soul. The specific language the organization uses is a fundamental part of this control. They don't have members, they have brothers and sisters, creating an illusion of family that makes any questioning feel like betrayal. They don't simply study the Bible. They study the organization's publications about the Bible, usually without even reading the full biblical text in context. The Watchtower and Awake magazines, published by the organization and considered essential spiritual food, come with numbered paragraphs and questions at the end whose answers must be underlined beforehand at home. At meetings, when these questions are asked, dozens of hands go up to give exactly the same underlined answer, word for word, and this is celebrated as evidence of spiritual unity. Any answer that goes beyond the paragraph, any attempt at critical analysis or genuine questioning, is subtly discouraged with forced smiles and later comments about staying humble and not thinking oneself wiser than the faithful and discreet slave, the term they use for the governing body. Ostracism is the most brutal tool of control they possess, though they rarely describe it with that raw word. Officially, they call it disfellowshipping when they expel someone, or disassociation when the person chooses to leave, but the practical result is identical. All witnesses must immediately cease any communication with the person, except the bare minimum necessary if they live together. This means parents stop speaking to children, children to parents, siblings to each other. Friends of decades become strangers overnight. I saw this happen dozens of times over the years before it happened to me. Brother Malcolm Jenkins disfellowshipped for smoking cigarettes after 28 years of faithful service, sitting alone at the back of the hall for months trying to be reinstated while his own wife and 3 children ignored him completely. Sister Patricia Owens disassociated at 19 for refusing to break up with a non-witness boyfriend, cut off from her family and found 6 months later living in a homeless shelter. These were not exceptional cases or abuses of the system. They were the system working exactly as designed. Elders' meetings took place in the back room of the Kingdom Hall, a windowless room with a scratched formica table and uncomfortable folding chairs where 3 appointed elders judged cases of alleged transgression. I became an elder at 32, a position of authority that came with the responsibility of shepherding the flock and sitting on these judicial committees. For 18 years, I sat in that room listening to confessions of sins, deciding spiritual fates, enforcing disfellowshippings. I remember the first time I participated in a judicial committee involving alleged sexual immorality. A young woman of 20 accused by her ex-boyfriend, also a witness, of having gone beyond what was allowed during courtship. For 3 hours we asked invasive questions about exactly what happened, demanding specific details about touches and kisses, justifying this obscene intrusion as necessary to determine the level of repentance. The girl cried uncontrollably, humiliated, but we kept pressing because the elder's manual specified that we needed to establish if there had been porneia, the Greek term for sexual immorality that the organization defines with absurd clinical rigidity. What disturbed me most, even when I still believed I was doing Jehovah's work, was the policy on child abuse. The Elder's Manual, a secret book not available to common members, instructs that allegations of child sexual abuse should only be reported to the authorities if local law specifically mandates it, and even then, only after consulting the legal department at headquarters. Internally, they require the two-witness rule, based on biblical scripture regarding resolving disputes. Without two witnesses to the abuse, usually impossible in cases of child sexual predation which happens in secret, the accused cannot be disciplined, and the victim is instructed to leave the matter in Jehovah's hands. I participated in an elders' meeting where we discussed the case of an 11-year-old girl who accused a respected ministerial servant of touching her inappropriately. There was no second witness. The manual was clear. We filed the case away with a generic warning to the accused about maintaining exemplary conduct, and sent the girl home with advice to pray more and strengthen her faith. 3 years later, he was arrested for abusing 5 children in the congregation. I had been complicit by following organizational rules blindly, placing the protection of the organization's reputation above the safety of children. That realization began to crack the foundation of my faith. The crack turned into an abyss in 2006, when the internet was still relatively new to many, and the organization hadn't yet developed its aggressive campaigns warning against online apostasy. I was 46, had been an elder for 14 years, and for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to do something absolutely forbidden: research the organization using outside sources. It started innocently, looking for information to refute criticisms a coworker had mentioned about false doomsday prophecies. The organization had predicted Armageddon for 1914, then 1925, then 1975, always reinterpreting the failures as adjustments of progressive understanding from Jehovah. I wanted to find explanations my colleague would accept to prove our faith had solid foundations. Instead, I found meticulous documentation of decades of doctrinal manipulation, changes in fundamental teachings presented as new light, but which completely contradicted what had been taught as absolute truth years prior, and testimonies from thousands of former members describing identical experiences of control and abuse. It was like waking up from a 40-year dream and realizing reality was completely different from what I had been told. I read about the organization's involvement with the United Nations as an associated NGO from 1992 to 2001, even while they taught members that the UN was the wild beast of the Book of Revelation and association with it meant apostasy. I read court documents from cases around the world where the organizations had been convicted of covering up child abuse, paying millions in out-of-court settlements while publicly denying any systemic problem. I read analyses of their biblical interpretations made by legitimate scholars of ancient Greek and Hebrew, demonstrating how they manipulated translations to support unique doctrines with no basis in the original texts. And I read hundreds of stories of people who had lost everything by leaving the organization, exactly as I was about to lose. For 6 months, I lived a torturous double life. Outwardly, I remained Winston Davies, respected elder of the West Midlands Central Congregation, giving talks at the Kingdom Hall, conducting Bible studies, sitting on judicial committees. Internally, I was crumbling. Every meeting became an exercise in dissimulation. Every public prayer felt like hypocrisy burning my tongue. I tried to talk to Sandra about my doubts, carefully testing the waters. She panicked immediately, crying and begging me to stop thinking about those things, saying it was an attack by Satan taking advantage of some spiritual weakness of mine. She suggested we talk to the elders, that I needed urgent spiritual help. I realized I didn't have an ally even in my own wife. Our intimacy had been conditioned by shared doctrine, and without that common ground, we were strangers sharing a roof. The decision to leave wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a gradual erosion, until the point where continuing to pretend became more painful than facing the consequences of honesty. I stopped going to meetings in March 2007. I made no grand announcement. I simply stopped showing up. Within a week, 2 elders appeared at my door for a shepherding visit, with concerned smiles and gentle questions about why I was absent. I said I had issues I needed to resolve personally. They offered help, to study with me, to pray with me. I politely refused. The visits became more frequent and less gentle. They wanted to know specifically what my doubts were, if I had been reading apostate material, if I was influencing others. I realized the concern was never genuinely about my spiritual well-being. It was damage control, ensuring my doubt didn't contaminate other members. Sandra filed for divorce in May, 2 months after I stopped attending. The organization allows divorce only in cases of adultery, or if a non-witness spouse physically abandons the believer, but she managed the argument that my apostasy constituted spiritual abandonment. The elders supported it, certainly relieved to remove my influence from the congregation through a formal matrimonial rupture. Abigail, then 20 years old and a regular pioneer, was instructed to cut contact with me completely. I remember the last time I spoke to my daughter, sitting in a cafe near the house where she lived with her mother. She was crying, holding a cup of tea that went cold untouched, saying she loved me but needed to obey Jehovah, and that obeying Jehovah meant treating me as dead until I returned to the organization. I asked if she truly believed a loving God would require her to cut off her own father for questioning the teachings of men. She didn't answer, just stood up and walked out. That was in June 2007. I haven't spoken to my daughter since then. 17 years of absolute silence. The ostracism Jehovah's Witnesses impose is not just social, it is existential. Every person you knew for 40 years, every relationship you built, every shared memory, everything evaporates instantly. People I had helped during personal crisis, whom I had supported financially when they were unemployed, with whom I had worked side by side building an extension to the Kingdom Hall during entire summers, would cross the street when they saw me approaching. In the supermarket, former friends turned their carts in the opposite direction. At work, the only witness in the firm requested a transfer to another department so he wouldn't have to interact with me. My mother, then 72 years old, sent a single letter explaining she had to choose between Jehovah and me, and that she chose Jehovah, and though it hurt, she hoped to see me in the resurrection if I came to my senses before Armageddon. The loneliness of the first few years was devastating in ways I cannot adequately express. Humans are social creatures, and spending 40 years in a closed community where every aspect of social life revolves around shared religion means that when you leave, you don't just lose a religion, you lose your entire infrastructure of human relationships. I had no friends outside the organization. I had never cultivated secular hobbies, because free time was supposed to be dedicated to preaching and theocratic activities. I didn't know how to simply talk to people about life's trivialities without the constant filter of whether that subject was appropriate for a Christian or if I should be using that opportunity to witness. I spent months virtually speaking to no one other than necessary transactional interactions for work and shopping. Depression was a constant companion those first 5 years, a sticky darkness that turned waking up every morning into an act of deliberate will. But something curious happens when you lose everything. You discover who you really are when all the layers of constructed identity are stripped away. I was no longer Elder Winston Davies of the West Midlands Central Congregation. I was no longer Sandra's husband or Abigail's active father. I was no longer a pioneer or a dedicated servant of Jehovah. I was simply Winston, a man of nearly 50 with a modest home, an adequate job, and the terrifying freedom to decide for myself what to think, what to do, how to live. It took years for this freedom to stop looking like an abyss and start looking like possibility. I started small, doing absurdly worldly things that had been forbidden. I watched my first R-rated movie, read philosophy books that questioned the existence of God, grew a beard which the organization discouraged for reasons never adequately explained, celebrated my own birthday for the first time at 53 with a store-bought cake and a solitary candle. I reconnected with humanity through unexpected paths. I volunteered at a local food bank, work I did in silence alongside atheists, Muslims, Catholics, agnostics, all united by the simple desire to feed the hungry without first evaluating their theological beliefs. The absence of a proselytizing agenda was a revelation. I joined a walking group for people over 50, where conversations revolved around aching knees, mischievous grandchildren, television shows, local politics, ordinary life gloriously free from constant spiritual evaluation. I befriended Derek, a retired history teacher who lived in the same building, and our long conversations about everything and nothing gradually taught me how to relate to another human being without the hidden agenda of converting them or measuring their spirituality. The years passed with a softer cadence than previous decades. I retired from accounting at 60, living modestly on a small but sufficient pension. My life was quiet, perhaps lonely by some standards, but it was mine. I thought, read, questioned, changed my mind without fearing a judicial committee. I developed a completely different understanding of spirituality, not based on obedience to an organization, but on a genuine connection with something greater than myself, indefinable and personal. I found an online community of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, thousands of us scattered around the world, sharing stories, processing trauma, supporting each other through a recovery that never really ends. It was through this group that I learned of the growing lawsuits against the organization throughout the Western world, victims of child abuse finally finding a voice, and lawyers willing to take on a billion-dollar religious corporation. Some former members I knew had joined these lawsuits as witnesses, sharing internal documents, exposing policies. And that is what brought me back onto the organization's radar after 17 years of mutual silence. The brown envelope that arrived that Tuesday in March was not a gesture of Christian love or an admission of error. It was a calculated attempt to silence a potentially problematic witness. The organization of Jehovah's Witnesses is facing unprecedented scrutiny, losing million-dollar court cases, being exposed in the international media for policies protecting abusers. Former elders like me, who have internal knowledge of how the system works, who participated in judicial committees, and possess copies of confidential manuals, are an existential threat to the public narrative they try to maintain. £15,000 and a house are a cheap investment to buy the silence of someone who could testify in court about decades of systematic cover-ups. But there are things money cannot buy, and dignity recovered after 40 years of psychological servitude is at the top of that list. Refusing that offer was the easiest decision I ever made, easier even than the original decision to leave, because this time I knew exactly who I was, and what my integrity was worth. It wasn't worth £15,000. It wasn't worth 15 million. It was worth the ability to look in the mirror and recognize an honest man looking back, a man who chose truth over comfort, freedom over belonging, courage over conformity. If you are reading this and recognize elements of your own story, whether in Jehovah's Witnesses or any other religious or social structure that controls through fear and ostracism, know that life exists on the other side. It is not an easy life, especially at the start, and I will not romanticize the pain of losing everyone you love. But it is your life, lived on your own terms, with a mind free to question and a heart free to love without conditions imposed by men who proclaim themselves spokesmen for God. At 60 years old, living alone in a modest apartment in Birmingham, having lost wife, daughter, mother, friends, for decades of history, I can honestly say I am happier and freer now than I ever was sitting in that Kingdom Hall repeating underlined answers and pretending it was the truth. The truth, I discovered, does not need an organization to validate it. The truth simply is, and when you finally stop fearing it, it liberates you from chains you didn't even know you were carrying.